One choice, one moment, one love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. Sometimes, the quietest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble, casting soft reflections that danced like whispers over the walls of Bellamy's, Manhattan's most exclusive dining room, where silence wasn't emptiness but a language of its own, spoken by those who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. And tonight, that silence was about to be broken in a way no one expected, least of all Ethan Caldwell, who sat at the center table with the kind of presence that bent the room. Around him, his tailored navy suit fitting like a second skin, his Patek Philippe resting against his wrist like a quiet declaration of power, his attention divided between a discreet call on his phone and the subtle movements of the staff who moved around him like shadows, unnoticed and unimportant, at least in his world, where people were either assets or obstacles, and rarely anything in between. And certainly never the young waitress approaching his table now, her steps measured, her posture straight but unassuming. Her name tag reading Clara Whitmore in simple black letters that revealed nothing about the depth behind her steady gaze, because Clara had learned long ago that the less people saw, the more freedom she had to observe, to listen, to understand. And tonight, she was listening more carefully than usual, because seated across from Ethan was a man who didn't belong to this polished American stage, a man whose presence carried something older, heavier, like history folded into his silence, his silver hair combed back with precision, his eyes sharp and watchful as they scanned the room with quiet judgment. And when he spoke, it wasn't in English but in a low, rolling dialect that seemed to ripple through the air like a forgotten melody, unfamiliar to most ears but unmistakably intentional. And just like that, the room shifted, the conversations dimmed, the staff hesitated, and even Ethan paused mid-sentence, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as he realized something he wasn't used to. Feeling uncertainty, because for the first time that evening, he didn't fully understand what was being said at his own table, and control, the thing he valued most, slipped just slightly from his grasp, and Clara noticed, because she noticed everything, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers stilled against the edge of his glass, the almost invisible flicker of irritation that crossed his eyes before he masked it again. And for a moment, she considered walking past, keeping her head down, letting the moment pass like any other, because that was the rule she lived by. Stay invisible, stay safe. But something in the older man's voice stopped her, not the words themselves but the tone, the subtle weight behind them. And before she could second-guess it, Clara stepped forward, just enough to enter the circle of light around the table, just enough to be seen, and for a heartbeat, no one noticed her. Not the diners nearby, not the staff frozen in quiet confusion, not even Ethan, whose attention was fixed on his father, until she spoke, soft but clear, her voice carrying just enough to cut through the silence without disturbing it. "Bonasera, Patri," she said, her pronunciation flawless, her tone respectful, and the effect was immediate. The older man's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers with a sharpness that hadn't been there before. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Ethan turned slowly, his gaze following his father's, landing on Clara as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not as background, not as staff, but as something unexpected, something he couldn't immediately categorize or control. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the language had shifted, not just in words but in power, and Clara stood there, calm, composed, her hands steady at her sides, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she hadn't just stepped into a world that wasn't supposed to notice her and changed it with a single sentence. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between the three of them, something that would ripple far beyond this room, because Ethan Caldwell, for all his wealth and influence, had just encountered something he couldn't buy, couldn't predict, and couldn't ignore. And Clara Whitmore, the quiet waitress no one had noticed minutes ago, had just become the most important person in the room without raising her voice even once. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, as if the entire room was waiting for someone to decide what this moment meant. And for once, Ethan Caldwell did not have the answer, his eyes fixed on Clara in a way that was no longer casual, no longer dismissive, but searching, calculating, trying to place her into a category that made sense. Because everything in his world had a category, a value, a purpose, and she did not fit into any of them. Not with the way she stood there, calm, unshaken, as if speaking in a rare Sicilian dialect to a man who had just tested an entire staff, was simply another part of her shift. And across the table, his father leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from suspicion to something quieter, something closer to recognition, as he responded in the same dialect, his voice softer now, more measured. And Clara answered without hesitation, her tone respectful but not submissive, precise but not rehearsed. And though most of the room could not understand a single word, they understood the effect, the shift in energy, the way authority had subtly moved from one side of the table to the other without anyone raising their voice. And Ethan felt it more than anyone, that quiet transfer of control, and it unsettled him in a way he did not appreciate, because he had built his life on being the one who understood, the one who anticipated, the one who stayed 3 steps ahead, and yet here he was, watching a waitress hold a conversation with his father that he could not follow, and worse, could not interrupt without exposing that gap. And he did not like gaps, not in his knowledge, not in his image, not in the carefully constructed identity that had carried him from a modest beginning to a billion-dollar empire. So when the exchange ended and his father gave a slow, approving nod, Ethan finally spoke. His voice controlled but edged with something sharper beneath the surface, asking in English, what exactly did she say? And for a brief moment, Clara looked at him, really looked at him, her gaze steady, assessing, as if deciding how much to reveal, before answering simply that his father had asked why no one here spoke to him properly. And she had apologized on behalf of the staff, and the explanation was clean, polite, and completely insufficient for what Ethan had just witnessed, because it did not explain the confidence, the fluency, the way his father's posture had shifted from guarded to engaged in seconds, and he knew it, and she knew that he knew it, but neither of them said anything more, because this was not a conversation about information, it was a quiet standoff, one that neither of them acknowledged out loud, and yet both understood perfectly, and then, just as smoothly as she had stepped into the moment, Clara stepped out of it, offering a small nod before turning away to continue her work, her movements returning to the rhythm of the room as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she had not just disrupted the balance of power at the most important table in the restaurant. And Ethan watched her go, his attention lingering longer than it should have, longer than he was comfortable admitting even to himself, because there was something about the way she walked, not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the absence of it, the quiet certainty, the lack of urgency to prove anything to anyone, and it contrasted sharply with the world he knew, where every gesture was calculated, every word measured, every interaction a transaction, and for the first time that evening, his focus shifted away from the deal he had been negotiating, away from the numbers and projections that usually occupied his mind, and settled instead on a question he did not yet have the answer to. Who was she? And more importantly, why did it bother him that he did not know? And across the table, his father broke the silence again, this time in English, his accent heavier but his meaning clear, telling Ethan that the girl understood more than she let on, that people like that were rare and should not be ignored, and Ethan gave a small, non-committal nod, the kind he used in meetings when he did not want to reveal his thoughts. But inside, something had already shifted, subtle but undeniable, because in a world where he controlled almost everything, the one thing he could not control was curiosity, and Clara Whitmore had just become the one variable he could not solve, not yet, and that, more than anything, made him lean back slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still, his decision forming not with urgency, but with quiet certainty, because if there was one thing Ethan Caldwell did not do, it was leave questions unanswered, and somewhere across the room, Clara paused for the briefest second, as if she felt the weight of that decision without turning around, before continuing on, her expression unchanged, her pace steady, as the night carried on around them, unaware that something had already begun to unfold beneath its surface. By the time the evening crowd thinned and the last of the high-profile guests filtered out into the cool Manhattan night, The tension from earlier had not disappeared. It had simply settled into something quieter, something more deliberate, like a question waiting patiently for its answer. And Ethan Caldwell did not like unanswered questions, not when they disrupted the clean, predictable patterns he relied on, not when they came wrapped in something as deceptively simple as a waitress with a calm voice and an impossible dialect. And yet that was exactly what he carried with him as he stepped into the back seat of his black sedan, the door closing with a soft, final sound that usually marked the end of his day. But tonight, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something he had not planned for. And as the car pulled away from the curb, his phone was already in his hand, his voice low and controlled as he gave a single instruction to his assistant: find everything on Clara Whitmore. And there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that suggested confusion, because this was not the kind of request he usually made, not about someone like her, not about someone who, on paper, should not matter. But Ethan did not explain. He never explained unless it served a purpose. And when the call ended, he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting to the city lights passing by the window, each one a reflection of the world he understood, structured, predictable, transactional. And yet his thoughts kept circling back to something that did not fit into that structure. The way she had spoken, the way she had not hesitated, the way she had not looked impressed. And that last part lingered, longer than the rest, because it was rare, almost non-existent in his experience, to encounter someone who did not react to his presence, his name, his position. And it was not arrogance that made him notice, it was pattern recognition. And Clara Whitmore had broken the pattern in a way that was both subtle and undeniable. And across the city, in a quieter part of Manhattan where the lights were softer and the streets less polished, Clara pushed open the door to her small apartment, the familiar creak of the hinge greeting her like an old friend, the space modest but clean, filled with the quiet evidence of a life lived without excess. A worn couch, a small kitchen table, a bookshelf lined with volumes that did not match the simplicity of her job, titles on linguistics, history, languages that most people would never need. And she set her bag down gently, her movements unhurried, as if the events of the evening had not unsettled her at all. And maybe they had not, at least not in the way they would have unsettled someone else, because Clara had learned long ago that attention was not always a gift. Sometimes it was a risk. And as she moved to the window, looking out at the distant skyline, her reflection faint against the glass, she exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried both awareness and acceptance, because she knew what that moment at the restaurant meant, not in detail, not yet, but in direction. And back in the moving car, Ethan's phone buzzed with a preliminary report faster than expected, a summary pulled from databases and public records, and he read it quickly, his expression remaining neutral, but his focus sharpening with each line. Age 27. Employment history consistent with service industry work. No notable education listed beyond a local community college. No travel records that would explain advanced fluency in regional Italian dialects. No affiliations, no public achievements. Nothing that justified what he had witnessed. And that was the problem, because the absence of information was, in his experience, never accidental. It was intentional, and he closed the file with a small, almost imperceptible shift in posture, his mind already moving ahead, recalibrating, because if the surface told him nothing, then he would have to look deeper, and he was very good at looking deeper. And the next morning, the city woke as it always did, loud, fast, indifferent, but in two different parts of it, two people moved through their routines with a shared, unspoken awareness that something had changed. Ethan standing in his office high above the streets, glass walls reflecting a skyline he had helped shape, his attention divided between a meeting he barely listened to and the thought of a question he intended to answer, and Clara tying the strings of her apron once again, stepping into the same restaurant with the same calm presence, as if the previous night had been just another shift, just another conversation. But as she moved through the dining room, her eyes scanning the space with quiet precision, there was a brief moment, almost too small to notice, where her gaze paused at the entrance, not in anticipation, not in hope, but in recognition of possibility, because some moments do not end when the night is over. They carry forward, subtle and persistent, shaping what comes next, and somewhere between intention and coincidence, That next moment was already on its way, because Ethan Caldwell did not walk away from anomalies, and Clara Whitmore was no longer just a passing detail in his world. She was a question, and he had already decided he was going to find the answer. The next evening did not announce itself with anything dramatic. No storm, no sudden interruption, just the quiet rhythm of a city that never truly stopped. And inside Bellamy's, the same polished elegance returned as if nothing unusual had ever happened. The soft clink of glassware, the low murmur of carefully measured conversations, the subtle choreography of staff moving in perfect coordination, and Clara Whitmore stepped into it all with the same composed presence, tying her apron with steady hands, her expression neutral, her pace unhurried. But there was something different beneath the surface, not visible to anyone else, not even to the colleagues who passed her without a second glance, but present in the way her eyes moved, just slightly more aware, just slightly more attentive to the entrance, as if she understood that some moments do not repeat, but their consequences do. And across town, Ethan Caldwell adjusted the cuff of his shirt in the reflection of a dark glass window before stepping out of his car, his movements precise, deliberate, as always. But his intention tonight was not business, not negotiation, not control. It was something far less familiar. Curiosity, and curiosity, in his world, was never passive. It was an action, a decision, a step forward. And when he entered the restaurant, the subtle shift in atmosphere was immediate, not because anyone announced him, but because presence like his did not require introduction. It was felt, acknowledged in the slight straightening of posture from the staff, the quick glances from nearby tables, the quiet recalibration of attention. But Clara did not turn immediately. She did not rush. She did not react in the way he had come to expect from people who recognized him, and that alone was enough to confirm that whatever this was, it was not going to follow the rules he was used to. And when she finally approached his table, her expression was the same as it had been the night before, calm, professional, unremarkable in the most deliberate way. And for a brief second, Ethan considered saying nothing, simply observing, simply waiting to see if she would reveal something on her own. But that was not his style. He did not wait for answers. He created the conditions to find them. So instead, he spoke first, his tone casual, almost too casual, as if the conversation carried no weight at all, and he attempted a greeting in Italian, not the polished version he had learned in brief, transactional exchanges, but something closer to what he had heard the night before, something rough, slightly misplaced, and the result was immediate. Clara paused, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to see. And then she corrected him, gently, without embarrassment, without superiority, simply stating that what he had just said did not mean what he thought it meant, that in fact, he had just greeted the room as if proposing marriage to the chef, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell was caught off guard in a way that was not strategic, not controlled, and the faintest trace of something unfamiliar crossed his expression, not anger, not irritation, but something closer to reluctant amusement, because the correction was precise, accurate, and delivered without any intention to impress, and that, more than anything, made it impossible to dismiss. And he let out a quiet breath, a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh if he allowed it to continue. But instead, he leaned back slightly, studying her more carefully now, not as a curiosity, not as an anomaly, but as someone who had just shifted the dynamic of the conversation again. And he asked, directly this time, where she had learned to speak like that, and Clara did not answer immediately, her eyes meeting his with the same steady calm, as if the question itself required evaluation, as if the answer was not something she gave freely. And when she did respond, it was simple, almost dismissive in its lack of detail. She said that people learn many things when they listen long enough. And then she asked if he was ready to order, and the conversation, at least on the surface, returned to normal. But nothing about it was normal anymore, because Ethan did not press. Not yet. He did not push further, because he recognized something in her response, not resistance, not defiance, but control, the same kind of control he valued in himself, the ability to decide what to reveal and what to keep hidden. And that recognition changed the way he approached the moment, because for the first time, this was not about extracting information. It was about understanding a person who did not operate on the same visible rules as everyone else. And as Clara moved away to place his order, the faintest hint of a smile touched her expression, not because of what he had said, but because of what he had not said, because he had chosen not to push, not to assert, and that choice, subtle as it was, marked the beginning of something neither of them had fully named yet, a shift not just in power, but in perspective, and, as the evening continued, the distance between their worlds felt just slightly smaller, not because it had been bridged, but because for the first time, both of them had taken a step toward the space in between. The rhythm between them did not announce itself. It built slowly, quietly, like a pattern forming beneath the surface of ordinary moments. And over the next few days, Ethan Caldwell returned to Bellamy's more often than his schedule reasonably allowed, not with grand gestures or obvious intent, but with the kind of subtle consistency that only someone used to controlling outcomes would recognize as deliberate. And each time, Clara Whitmore was there, moving through the dining room with the same calm efficiency, the same quiet presence that neither demanded attention nor avoided it. And yet somehow, every time she approached his table, the space around them seemed to shift just slightly, as if the noise of the room softened, as if the world outside their conversation paused just enough to let something else exist in its place. And their exchanges remained brief, professional on the surface, but layered with something more, something unspoken, because neither of them rushed, neither of them filled the silence unnecessarily. And in those pauses, meaning accumulated, small, precise, undeniable, and Ethan found himself adjusting in ways he had not anticipated, not changing who he was, but recalibrating how he engaged, choosing his words with a different kind of awareness, listening more than he spoke, not because he lacked something to say, but because he had begun to understand that with Clara, what was not said often carried more weight than what was. In one evening, as the city outside softened under a steady rain that traced slow lines down the restaurant windows, Ethan set his phone aside completely for the first time since he had walked in, not placing it face down as a gesture, but simply removing it from the moment as if it no longer belonged there. And when Clara arrived at his table, there was a brief flicker of recognition in her eyes, not surprise, not approval, just acknowledgement, as if she had noticed the shift and chose not to comment on it. And he asked her, not about the menu, not about the wine, but about Sicily, the word itself spoken carefully, without pretense, and Clara paused, just long enough to mark the question as intentional, before answering, her voice steady, her tone unchanged, describing a place where the air carried salt even miles from the coast, where conversations stretched longer than necessary because people valued presence more than efficiency, where language was not just words but identity, history, belonging. And as she spoke, Ethan listened, really listened, not with the strategic focus he applied in meetings, but with something quieter, something closer to curiosity without agenda. And for a moment, the distance between their worlds did not disappear, but it became less rigid, less defined, as if there was space for something new to exist between them. And then, as naturally as it had begun, the moment shifted again, the conversation returning to the practical, the immediate, the simple act of taking an order. But the tone had changed, subtly but permanently. And later that night, long after the restaurant had closed and the city had settled into its quieter hours, Clara walked through the narrow streets toward her apartment, the rain having faded into a light mist that clung to the air, and her thoughts moved differently now, not unsettled, not distracted, but aware of a presence that had begun to extend beyond the walls of Bellamy's, not in a way that intruded, but in a way that lingered. And she stopped briefly under the dim glow of a street lamp, her reflection faint in the glass of a closed storefront, and for a moment, she allowed herself to consider the possibility she had been avoiding, that this was no longer just a passing interaction, no longer just a moment that would fade with time, but something that had the potential to continue, to evolve. And that recognition carried both clarity and caution, because Clara did not move through life without intention, and she understood that some connections, once acknowledged, could not be undone. And across the city, in an office that overlooked a skyline he had spent years mastering, Ethan stood alone, his reflection mirrored in the glass as he held a file that still contained more questions than answers, the details unchanged, the gaps still present, and yet his focus had shifted, because for the first time, the information mattered less than the experience, less than the conversations, less than the way she had spoken about a place he had never truly understood, and he closed the file without frustration, without urgency, setting it aside with a quiet finality that surprised even him, because this was not a problem to solve, not entirely. It was something else, something that required patience, presence, and perhaps for the first time in a long time, a willingness to let something unfold without forcing it into a defined outcome. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, reflecting in the glass like distant stars, Ethan Caldwell stood still, not calculating, not planning, but simply considering. And somewhere in that stillness, the realization settled, quiet but certain, that whatever this was, it was no longer just curiosity. It was something deeper, something he did not yet name, but did not intend to walk away from either. The invitation did not come as a grand gesture. It arrived quietly, almost casually, folded into a moment that could have been mistaken for routine, and yet nothing about it was routine, not for Ethan Caldwell, and certainly not for Clara Whitmore, because when he spoke that evening, his tone carried a different weight, not the controlled authority he used in boardrooms, not the polished charm expected in social settings, but something simpler, more direct, as he asked if she would join him for coffee after her shift, not as an order, not as an assumption, but as a question, and the question itself lingered between them longer than the words, because it carried implications neither of them ignored, and Clara did not answer immediately, her gaze steady, thoughtful, as if she was measuring not just the request but the intention behind it. And for a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded again, replaced by the quiet tension of choice, and then she nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that held no hesitation, only decision, and the rest of the evening passed with a subtle shift neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both felt in the way time seemed to move differently, slower, more aware, until finally the last table cleared, the lights softened, and Clara stepped out into the cool night air where Ethan was already waiting, his presence less imposing outside the controlled environment of the restaurant. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested he was stepping into unfamiliar territory without trying to dominate it. And they walked without urgency, side by side, the city around them alive with distant sounds and soft light, until they reached a small cafe that did not carry the weight of status or expectation, just warmth, quiet, and the simple comfort of anonymity. And inside, they sat across from each other with steaming cups between them, the silence not awkward, not forced, but natural, as if neither of them felt the need to fill it immediately. And when they did begin to speak, the conversation unfolded differently than anything either of them had expected, not driven by strategy or curiosity alone, but by something that felt unexpectedly balanced. As Clara spoke about her grandfather in Sicily, a man who believed language was not something you learned, but something you lived, who had taught her to listen before speaking, to understand before responding, and Ethan listened without interruption, without redirecting the conversation back to himself, something he rarely allowed, because, for once, he was not interested in control, he was interested in understanding, and when he did speak, it was not about business or success, but about the cost of always being in control, the isolation that came with being the one everyone expected answers from, the quiet realization that power often came at the expense of connection. And Clara did not react with surprise or sympathy. She simply listened, the same way she had been taught, fully present, without judgment. And in that moment, something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably, because for the first time, Ethan Caldwell was not being measured by his achievements, and Clara Whitmore was not being underestimated for her position. They were simply two people sharing space, sharing truth, without performance. And as the hours passed, and the cafe grew quieter, the world outside fading into the background, the distance between them continued to narrow, not because either of them forced it, but because neither of them resisted it. And when they finally stepped back into the night, the air cooler now, the city quieter, there was a pause, brief but significant, as they stood facing each other, neither rushing to leave, neither extending the moment unnecessarily, just allowing it to exist as it was. And Ethan spoke first, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with something closer to honesty, saying that he had not expected this. Not the conversation, not the ease, not the way it felt to simply be present without needing to control the outcome. And Clara's response was quiet, almost a whisper against the night air, as she said that some things are not meant to be expected, they are meant to be experienced, and the words settled between them, soft but lasting, as they exchanged a final glance that held more meaning than anything they had said, before turning in opposite directions, each carrying the same quiet awareness that something had begun, something neither of them fully understood yet, but neither of them intended to ignore, because in a world defined by certainty and control, they had just stepped into something that required neither, and somehow, that made it more real than anything else. The distance between understanding and assumption is often where everything breaks. And for Ethan Caldwell, that distance had never felt wider than it did 3 days after that quiet night at the cafe, when the world he had carefully balanced began to press back against something he had not yet defined. Because in his office, surrounded by glass and steel and the quiet hum of decisions that shaped entire industries, a different kind of conversation unfolded, one that did not carry the softness of shared stories or the patience of silence, but the sharp edge of expectation. As his senior partners questioned his recent absence from key meetings, the subtle delays in decisions that once came effortlessly to him, and Ethan responded as he always did, composed, precise, offering answers that satisfied the surface without revealing the truth beneath, because the truth was not something he was ready to articulate, not even to himself, and yet it followed him, persistent, quiet, in the spaces between tasks, in the moments when his attention drifted from numbers to something far less predictable. And across the city, Clara Whitmore moved through her own routine with the same steady rhythm. But something had shifted there as well, not in her actions, not in her calm presence, but in the awareness that now accompanied her. The recognition that the connection she had allowed to exist was no longer contained within a single evening or a quiet conversation. It had extended into something that could not be ignored without consequence. And she understood consequences. She had built her life around anticipating them, around choosing paths that minimized risk, that protected the quiet stability she had created. And yet this was different, because it was not imposed on her. It was chosen, and that made it harder to step away from. And when Ethan returned to the restaurant that evening, the air felt different, not because of anything visible, but because of what had been left unresolved, and Clara noticed it immediately, the slight tension in his posture, the way his gaze lingered not with curiosity, but with something heavier, something closer to conflict. And when she approached his table, the usual balance between them did not settle as easily as before, because Ethan spoke without the careful pacing he had begun to adopt, his words more direct, more pointed, as he mentioned, almost casually, that he had looked into her background, that there were inconsistencies, gaps that did not align with what he had seen, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not outwardly reactive, but undeniable. As Clara's stillness deepened, her expression unchanged but her presence shifting in a way that signaled something important had just been crossed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the conversation had moved from understanding to assumption, from curiosity to control, and Clara's voice, when it came, was softer than before, but carried a clarity that cut through the tension without raising itself, as she said that some things are not meant to be investigated, they are meant to be respected. And Ethan's response came quickly, almost instinctively, as he said that respect comes from knowing, from understanding what stands in front of him. And that was when the silence returned, not fragile this time, not uncertain, but firm, grounded, as Clara met his gaze without hesitation and replied that not everything valuable needs to be explained to be real, and the words settled between them with a weight neither of them could ignore, because this was no longer a quiet exchange of perspectives. It was a boundary, clearly drawn, and Ethan felt it, not as resistance, but as something more challenging, something that required him to reconsider the way he approached not just her, but everything he had assumed about control. And for the first time, the possibility entered his mind that this was not a situation he could solve through information or strategy, that perhaps the more he tried to define it, the further he moved from understanding it. And Clara stepped back then, not abruptly, not with anger, but with the same composed movement she always carried, creating space without announcing it. And as she turned to continue her work, the distance between them felt larger than it had at any point before, not because something had ended, but because something had been tested, and neither of them yet knew what that test would reveal. And later that night, as the city stretched into its quieter hours once again, Ethan stood alone in his office, the skyline reflecting back at him like a question without an answer, his thoughts replaying the conversation not for its details, but for what it had exposed, the instinct he had followed, the line he had crossed, and for the first time in a long time, he did not justify it. He did not rationalize it. He simply recognized it for what it was, a mistake, not an action, but an approach. And across the city, Clara sat by her window, the lights distant and steady, her reflection calm but thoughtful, not shaken, not uncertain, but aware that the path forward would require something more than silence, something more than patience, because connection, once acknowledged, could not exist without trust, and trust, once challenged, did not return on its own. And somewhere between them, in the space shaped by words spoken and unspoken, the question remained, not whether something had begun, but whether it could continue. And neither of them, for the first time since this began, had a clear answer. Some silences do not push people apart. They reveal who is willing to step closer. And for Ethan Caldwell, the silence that followed that night did not feel like distance. It felt like a mirror, reflecting something he had not wanted to see about himself. And the next morning, the city moved as it always did, efficient, indifferent, relentless, but Ethan did not follow its rhythm the same way. Because instead of walking into his office and diving into numbers and decisions, he stood for a moment longer than usual by the glass wall overlooking Manhattan, his reflection steady but thoughtful, replaying not what Clara had said, but what he had done, the instinct to investigate, to reduce a person to information, to believe that understanding came from control, and for the first time, he did not justify it. He did not frame it as necessary or strategic. He simply recognized it as misplaced. And that recognition carried weight, because it meant the next step would not come from habit, but from choice. And across the city, Clara Whitmore moved through her morning with the same quiet precision, her routine unchanged on the surface, but beneath it, there was clarity, not about him, not about what would happen next, but about herself, about the boundaries she had set and why they mattered. Because her life had not been built on chance, it had been built on careful decisions, on knowing when to step forward and when to step back. And what had happened the night before had not shaken her. It had simply reminded her of the line she refused to let anyone cross, no matter who they were. And that certainty allowed her to continue as she always did, calm, present, focused. And when the evening came and the doors of Bellamy's opened once again, there was no expectation, no anticipation, just the steady flow of another night, until the moment shifted, quiet but unmistakable, when Ethan walked in, not with the usual ease of someone who owned the room, but with a different kind of presence, one that did not demand attention, but did not avoid it either. And Clara noticed, not because she was looking for him, but because she noticed everything. And when she approached his table, the space between them felt different, not tense, not unresolved, but open in a way that had not been there before. And Ethan did not begin with a question. He did not reference the past conversation. He did not try to explain or defend. He simply said that he had been wrong. And the words, simple as they were, carried more weight than anything else he could have said, because they were not framed, not softened, not redirected. They were direct, clear, and entirely his and Clara's. Response was not immediate. Not because she doubted the words, but because she understood their significance, because someone like Ethan Caldwell did not speak like that without intention. And when she did respond, her voice remained steady, her expression calm, as she said that understanding does not come from knowing everything. It comes from knowing when to stop searching, and the conversation that followed did not rush forward. It unfolded slowly, carefully, as if both of them were aware that something important was being rebuilt, not from explanation, but from presence. And later that evening, as the restaurant quieted and the city softened once more, Ethan stood outside again, waiting, not out of habit, not out of expectation, but because he chose to. And when Clara stepped out, there was no hesitation this time, no pause filled with uncertainty, just a quiet acknowledgement as she joined him, and they walked without direction, without urgency, the city stretching around them in soft light and distant sound, until they reached the edge of the river where the air carried a different kind of stillness, and they stopped there, side by side, looking out at the water reflecting the skyline. And Ethan spoke again, not to explain, not to justify, but to share, saying that for most of his life, he had believed that control was the same as understanding, that if he knew enough, if he saw everything, he could never be caught off guard. And Clara listened, the same way she always did, fully, without interruption. And when he finished, she said quietly that control is often just a way of avoiding trust. And the words settled between them, not as a challenge, but as a truth. And, for a moment, neither of them moved, because in that stillness, something shifted again, not in power, not in distance, but in direction, as if they had both stepped into a space where neither control nor silence alone was enough, where something new was required, something built not on certainty, but on choice. And as the city lights reflected across the water, steady and endless, Ethan turned slightly toward her, not with the certainty he carried in every other part of his life, but with something quieter, something real. And in that moment, the distance that had once separated them did not disappear. It transformed into something neither of them needed to overcome, but something they could choose to cross together. Some endings do not arrive with finality. They arrive with a quiet sense of continuation. And as Ethan Caldwell stood beside Clara Whitmore by the river, the city stretching endlessly behind them, and the water reflecting 1,000 distant lights, there was no grand declaration, no dramatic shift, only the steady realization that something had already changed in a way neither of them could undo. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not try to define it, did not try to place it into a framework that made it easier to control, because he understood now that some things lost their meaning the moment you tried to contain them. And instead, he chose something far simpler, far more unfamiliar. He chose honesty, not the polished version he used in negotiations, not the measured responses that protected his position, but something quieter, more personal. As he said that for all the years he had spent building a life that looked complete from the outside, there had always been a space he could not fill, something missing that he had never been able to identify until now. And Clara listened, her gaze steady, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just present, the way she had always been. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had first shifted the room days ago. As she said that people often spend years searching for something they can only recognize when they stop looking for it. And the words settled between them with a quiet certainty, not as an answer, but as an understanding. And in that moment, Ethan did something he had never done before without calculation. He reached for her hand, not abruptly, not with hesitation, but with a simple, deliberate motion that carried no expectation beyond the gesture itself. And Clara did not pull away. She did not question it. She simply allowed it, her hand resting in his with the same quiet confidence that defined everything she did. And the contact was not dramatic, not overwhelming. It was steady, real, the kind of connection that did not need to announce itself to be understood. And they stood like that for a moment longer, the city moving around them, unchanged and indifferent, while something within that moment held its own meaning, separate from everything else. And over the following weeks, the rhythm of their lives began to shift, not in ways that disrupted what they had built, but in ways that expanded it, as Ethan continued to lead his world with the same precision and clarity, but with a growing awareness that not everything needed to be controlled to be valuable. And Clara continued her work at the restaurant, not because she lacked other options, but because it was part of who she was, part of the life she had chosen, and neither of them tried to reshape the other. Neither of them imposed expectations that did not belong. They simply allowed the connection to exist as it was, steady, evolving, grounded in something deeper than convenience or circumstance. And there were moments, small and unremarkable to anyone else, that carried the most weight. A quiet conversation over coffee after a long day, a shared glance across a crowded room, a pause in the middle of a sentence that said more than the words themselves. And in those moments, the difference between their worlds did not disappear. It became something they understood, something they respected, something that added to what they were building rather than taking away from it. And one evening, as they walked through the city once more, the lights reflecting off the glass towers that had once defined everything for Ethan, he stopped for a moment, turning slightly toward Clara, with a softness in his expression that had not been there before, not because he had changed who he was, but because he had allowed something new to exist alongside it. And he said that he had spent most of his life believing that success was measured by what you could hold on to, what you could control, what you could prove. But now he understood that some of the most important things could not be measured that way, and Clara smiled, not brightly, not dramatically, but in that quiet way that carried more meaning than anything else, as she replied that the most important things are usually the ones you cannot explain, only feel, and the words lingered between them, soft but lasting, as they continued walking, not toward a defined destination, not toward an ending, but forward, together, and somewhere in the quiet space between control and trust, between silence and understanding, between two lives that had once moved in completely different directions, they found something that did not need to be named to be real, something that did not need to be proven to be true, something that simply existed, steady and certain, in the way their hands remained intertwined as the city moved on around them, unchanged, unaware, and somehow, for the first time, that did not matter at all. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share this video and share with us where you are watching from, and subscribe to When He Chose Her channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful, emotional stories like this to life. Stay with us for more moments where quiet strength changes everything.